4. Amory of Lusignan addressed the court with the confidence of a man who knew his position was secure. The son of a Poitarian noble, he had been involved in a failed revolt against his liege lord, forcing him to flee his lands. With the rebellion crushed and his future in doubt, Amory had followed the path of his warrior sires and made for Jerusalem, where he had found favour in Amalric's court. His fortunes had risen considerably when Agnes of Courtenay became his patron, funding his ventures and introducing him to powerful circles. They had risen further still when he married Eschiva, daughter of Baldwin of Ibelin, cementing his place as a man of import. He strutted across the marble courtyard, his thick golden-brown mane framing his square jaw and sharp, near-yellow eyes. He had eschewed the oriental style of the lesser nobles, preferring a simple linen shirt and breeches. A green cloak so finely woven it seemed as smoke on his trail was his one concession to court fashion. To Dietmar, Amory resembled one of the kings of old, tall, handsome, fierce, and proud. Not like the fat king reclining in his chair, his belly turned to butter, his breasts like a woman's. But for all King Amalric's faults, he had ruled wisely as any man could have in his position, while Amory had turned Judas and betrayed his own lord. Dietmar had overheard Thomas and Alderman gossiping about Amory, claiming that his brothers had murdered the Earl of Salisbury using a blade gifted to them by Amory before he fled to Jerusalem. Such rumours were hostile things, but the Lord of Lusignan's silence on the matter did make Dietmar wonder. Amory came to a stop beside the seneschal's chair and smiled warmly at his audience. When he spoke, his voice was like mulled wine to their ears. "Honoured friends," he began, his hand raised in simple greeting, "would that I were here to bring you better tidings, to tell you that the days of peace will continue, and that our greatest concern remains the shipping of wine and cheese to fill our bellies and wood to fill our hearths." A few laughs greeted his words, and some of the nobles raised their cups. But there was a subtle tension in the courtyard now. Everyone had heard of Saladin's growing brazenness, and the threat to the kingdom was becoming tangible. "I will speak plainly," Amory continued, touching the seneschal's shoulder with an easy familiarity, while the diminutive Miles of Plancy appeared like a bald rat next to his cutting figure. "Our enemies have flourished, while we have slumbered in our winter halls. Nur ad-Din's unification of Aleppo and Mosul, along with his conquest of Edessa and Benias, means a united Seljuk empire now stands at our doorstep. The eyes of its master are now fixed on Outremer, and its most precious prize, Jerusalem. While we have occupied ourselves with petty rivalries, our defences have fallen into disrepair, our swords have dulled, and our arms have weakened. If the forces of Islam were to march upon us now, we would surely fall." Amory turned to Amalric's seat, acknowledging the king for the first time. Last, after the seneschal, after his audience. His voice dripped with sweetness as he ingratiated himself with his master. "If not for the efforts of our noble liege, we might have already perished. Was it not he who took the war to Egypt and enlisted the aid of Constantinople? Was it not he who negotiated the peace with the Saracens?" A murmur of agreement spread through the courtyard, a soft chorus of approval. Amalric blinked once, regarding the strutting lord of Lusignan with something bordering on contempt. He knew the words carried a double meaning. Amalric had indeed saved the kingdom, but he had also allowed its defences to crumble. He had sallied forth against the Fatimid Empire, but failed to seize Egypt and keep his Greek allies honest. The king of Jerusalem harboured no love for Amory of Lusignan, whose patron, Agnes of Courtenay, had once been his wife. Some said she had taken the young noble as her lover. With a flick of his wrists, Amalric silenced his chirping advisers. Taking a deep sip from his silver goblet, he allowed wine to trickle down his beard and into the ruffles of his tunic. Then he nodded to Amory. "Say your piece. You have my ear." The king's voice, usually marked by a stammer, was now smooth and cold. Dietmar wondered at the fury that could cure such an impediment, if only for a moment. Amory bowed graciously, his smile fixed. He knew the game he played, and played it well. "We now stand at a crossroads," Amory proclaimed, turning to the open courtyard with his back to the king. "Like our fathers who crossed the Taurus Mountains, we have a choice, whether to stay or to go, whether we remain masters of God's kingdom or to be mere chattel, to be laid open by Saracen blades." "Stay," a young nobleman called, slamming his empty cup against his bench. His face flushed with drink. He had the mood of the nobles with him. "Oh, we stay," shouted another to cheers from the crowd. Amory's smile widened. "You have my heart, friends, but it will not be so easy. While the tide of Nur ad-Din rises, another threat appears to bite at our heels. The dog, Saladin." A chorus of boos greeted Amory's pronouncement, and 2 knights from Poitiers barked like mad dogs, showing their teeth. Dietmar glanced around the benches, staring at the once dignified nobles. The court's atmosphere had transformed. Gone was the solemnness of before, replaced by the easy mood of a mummers' show, with Amory as its hero. He looked back to the Lord of Lusignan. Oily bastard, he thought, though he couldn't deny Amory's talent for showmanship. Amory laughed, extending his hand and pointing to the barking knights with enthusiasm, joining in with the clapping crowd. Arne turned to give Dietmar a sour look. "I know those knights," he said. "They came across with Amory from Poitiers." "They're from his household, then." Dietmar glanced at the barking knights. "They bark like mutts because their master told them to," he said, looking back at the Dane. It was all part of the show, just like everything else. Arne grinned. "And they call the Saracen a dog." Amory's voice suddenly softened, and his barking hands fell silent on cue. "A dog must still be disciplined if it is to heel at its master's feet," he said, the crowd straining to hear. Then louder, "The dog must know the whip if it is to obey. Saladin has forgotten the whip, and so he snarls at us, building up the courage to bite." "What must be done?" one of the Poitiers knights called out, and other voices joined in, until the whole court was up in roaring clangor. Amory smiled, his golden eyes gleaming with triumph. They would do anything for him now. When their calls subsided, silent anticipation settled upon the royal palace. Not even the songbirds at the king's ear dared break it. Amory let the moment linger, slowly pacing the courtyard, his head down in thought. "We must show our strength," he declared, turning on his feet to face them once more. "We must gather our arms beneath the one true cross, and make an example of Saladin while he and his master are still at odds. We can take him now, strike down this mangy desert dog, but only if we act swiftly. What say you?" The courtyard swelled with the eruption of the nobles, their cheers and cries for war bouncing off the stone walls like a howling wind. The Poitiers knights banged their cups against their seats, and others joined in, adding to the roar. Even Arne was swept up by Amory's appeal and cried, "Dios le vult," while raising his hands in salute, as if Amory were a long-lost Roman emperor and not some upstart young lord seeking to bloody his sword. "And have us blooded in turn? Are we so foolish as this, to run toward death at the first sound of honeyed words?" Dietmar chuckled inwardly. Of course they were. That was precisely how they'd come to be in Jerusalem in the first place. Honeyed words and faith. That was all it took to rile up the forces of Christendom. But not all men were so easily convinced. He spared Amalric a glance and saw that the king's face remained unchanged. with nary an eyebrow raised to betray his emotions. Amalric wouldn't have risen so high if the lines on his face were as easy to read as a palimpsest. Or perhaps Dietmar simply lacked the ability to decipher it. Still, he thought he glimpsed the white of Amalric's knuckles before the king unclenched his fist and called for more wine. Miles of Plancy waited until the cheers subsided before rising from his seat, only to be greeted by a renewed roar as soon as he stood. "A vote!" he called out, attempting to make his voice heard over the clamour of the other nobles. "We must vote on Amory's proposal." Amory didn't bother trying to restore order. He knew the will of the crowd would not be stifled. It could only be directed one way or another. He laughed at the seneschal's feeble efforts, clasping his hands before him and bowing to the benches. Dietmar thought he looked like a lion then, with his golden eyes and flowing mane, his teeth bared back, and around him a court of fools, laughing hyenas, who would follow whoever wielded the biggest sword, whoever's bite proved sharpest. "Silence!" Reynald suddenly roared, slamming his fist against his seat and rising to glare at those around him. He waited until not even a breath stirred in the crowded courtyard before turning his gaze to the seneschal. His glare had softened, but only just. "Perhaps it would be wise to hear from other parties before calling a vote," Reynald declared. "Amory's words ring true, but he is one man, and to decide our fates on the say-so of one man would be imprudent." Miles of Plancy widened his eyes at Reynald's words, embarrassed, or perhaps he was imagining the bear of Sidon smashing his bald head in like an egg. Of course, my lord," the seneschal replied. "We will open the court and hear from all interested parties. Forgive my hastiness." Reynald nodded slowly, wrinkling his mouth in disdain, and then sat back down to engage in a hushed conversation with Theobald of Tabor. While the Count of Sidon may have missed the hateful glare Amory cast his way, Geldemar of Tiberiad did not. The swordsman-cum-judge rapped his cup against his seat, catching Amory's eye, and then smiled at him, a fox to a lion. Amory blinked first. By the time order had returned to the court, the seneschal was ready to call the first witness. The Patriarch of Alexandria had abandoned his post when Saladin seized control of Egypt, displacing the existing hierarchy like a pike thrown into a pool of carp. The Patriarch told the court of the horrors that had befallen the Christians who remained, describing churches torn to the ground and others that still stood only to be converted into Muslim places of worship. His recollection stirred something in the audience, his words falling on sympathetic ears. Discontented voices soon rose in disgust as he detailed the plight of Christians in Saladin's Egypt. If he were to be believed, they were being dragged from their homes and thrown into the sea. If he were to be believed, the once great churches of Alexandria now served as temples to Allah. Never mind that they had been Muslim houses of worship before the Christians came. Never mind that they had done the same to the mosques in Jerusalem, and worse. Amory no longer needed his Poitiers knights to sway the crowd's sentiment. They followed his lead willingly now. "Bastard heathens," Arn muttered, crossing himself as the Patriarch concluded his testimony. "We should have broken their backs when we had the chance." When would that have been? Dietmar wanted to ask. When barely a handful of knights and peasants had stumbled their way into Jerusalem? God had smiled on them that day. But if they had tried their luck any further, they would have all died in the sands. Every attempt after had ended in failure. Perhaps God's will extended only as far as Jerusalem, and the other great cities were not meant for them. Such thoughts were best kept to oneself, and Dietmar maintained his silence, nodding in agreement with Arn's words. With his testimony complete, the Patriarch rose from the seneschal's seat and slowly made his way back to his bench along the aisle. The gold on his fingers caught the midday sun, and Dietmar wondered how much truth had passed the Patriarch's lips. How much had he really lost? Next, Odo of St. Amad, the master of the Templars, informed them of the threat Saladin posed to the routes connecting Jerusalem to Hebron and to the eastern towns of Jericho and Amman. According to the knight, the Kurd was both the greatest threat to Christian security and also powerless in the face of Templar steel. It was precisely the sort of existential threat, coupled with bravado, that Dietmar had come to expect from the Order, whose fortunes were inextricably tied to their ability to conduct violence and expand the limits of their domain. Odo's words were, Dietmar thought, less well received. Everyone knew of the Templars' interests in the south, and of their growing estates, and their voracious appetite for more. Odo had grown rich, and his beady black eyes were always on the lookout for more profit. Finally, long after the sun had reached its zenith, when renewed calls for a vote were being voiced by tired nobles, Ybert of Syria took to the front of the court. He swept down the aisle, his black mantle billowing behind him. He waved away an offered seat, sending the seneschal scurrying behind the gallery with a pointed flick of his head, and came to stand between Amalric's chair and the judges' empty benches, where Amory of Lusignan was now hovering. The Master of Hospitallers fixed a lingering gaze upon Amory and then bowed to the king. When he turned to the court, his words were sharp and cutting. "What miserable curs you all are, to fall for such tricks!" Gasps erupted from the crowd, and someone even laughed. Dietmar thought it might have been Geldemar. "Did we not learn our lesson in Banias?" Ybert continued, "when Nur-ad-Din washed us away like the tide, or in Egypt, and not even the combined arms of Komnenos and Outremer could dislodge Saladin from his throne? Bah!" His words were met with silence. The Knight Lord strode across the open square, sweeping the benches with his hard stare, and then turned to look at Amory once more. The Hospitaller was tall and cadaverous, with a wispy beard and heavy-set features. His gaunt face was marked by the scars he'd earned campaigning against Nur-ad-Din in Syria the decade before. He had lost a finger to a Seljuk blade in Harenk, but taken the head of the Faris in return. Ybert was no friend to the king. They often clashed over the crimes of certain knights within his order, and each time the Knight Lord fell back on the protection offered by the Pie Postulatio Voluntatis, the papal bull recognizing the sovereignty of his order, much to Almaric's frustration. To be usurped of authority in your own kingdom. Dietmar could understand the king's annoyance. The knightly orders proved an effective weapon when their aims aligned with the king's, but more often than not they became thorns in his side. Still, the master was no fool, and had grown weary of endless conflict and its costs. His predecessor, Gilbert d'Assily, had been deposed while still alive due to his lavish spending. Ybert would not see the same thing repeated. "Do you think the fate of your father is lost on us?" Ybert said, his expression softening as the whites of his teeth showed under his top lip. "No man deserves to live out his last days in a Saracen cell. To die in one? Your desire for vengeance is as natural as God's grace, but do not mistake your anger for wisdom. You would see the whole kingdom devoured to sate your lust for vengeance." A murmur spread through the court, the gaze of every noble fixed on Amory. Dietmar thought he saw the king smile into his wine. The Poitiers lord smiled too, but it was a cruel thing, his upper lip curled in a leonine snarl. "You deny the threat to Jerusalem?" Amory stepped forward, his body turned toward the crowd, ever the showman. Deftly done, Dietmar thought. Amory had sidestepped Ybert's first thrust, his father's death in the hands of Saracen jailers, and instead appeared to the fears of the audience a skilful parry and riposte. Ybert's eyes narrowed. "There can be no denial. The threat is indeed great. Only it is your—" "This knight of the cloth," Amory continued before Ybert could finish, "would have us cower in our homes, waiting for the dog and his master to tear down our doors and feast upon our flesh. Where is the honour in that, I ask? Where is the wisdom?" coward!" one of the Poitiers knights shouted, before being dragged back to his seat by his neighbour. This was not a matter for the crowd. Ybert growled, standing straight as Amory began circling him on the courtyard floor. The Hospitaller towered over the Frenchman, but he was all bone and sinew, gangly-looking next to this young nobleman, who looked like a king. "I call for prudence," Ybert declared to the court. "We are not so strong that we can amble into the desert and recover from another loss at the hands of its master." Amory laughed now. "So it is our arms that you doubt? You do not think our brave knights are fit to task? Perhaps that is why you fill your ranks with so many Turcopoles?" Ybert's mouth tightened, his hands clenched at his sides. "They are good, Christian men," the crowd murmured again, and there was laughter from the back seats. The Hospitaler's face reddened. He was not used to being mocked. Shaking his head, he glared into the aisles before fixing his gaze upon Amory, who smiled back at him. Ybert knew he had been outmatched. "Heed my words," Ybert said, his dark eyes like empty sockets in his skull. "When Saladin sinks his teeth into your neck, you will find that he is no mere dog, but a wolf, and that his teeth are long and many. Then you will realize that this task has been folly and your life ended too soon. And for what? Vain pride. For that, you will condemn us all. Bah!" Amory watched as the master strode back toward his bench, but the young lord wasn't content to leave it at that. "Go, ring your bell, Hospitaller," he called out, mimicking the motion with his hand. Once, twice, and then he clenched his fist, twisting the gesture into something vulgar. Dietmar winced, feeling the tension ripple through those who recognized the insult around him. Amory had invoked a dispute from the Hospitaler's history when they had clashed with the Patriarch over land and money. They had rung their bells during his sermons to fluster the poor man. It was a shameful memory, not befitting of the noble order, but the gesture had taken on another meaning. Wanker. Ybert slowed his steps, and for a moment Dietmar thought he might turn and confront the lord. But the moment passed, and Ybert of Syria returned to his seat, with no blood spilt. "Vote!" a voice called, and then another, and another, until the seneschal reappeared from beneath the gallery to order proceedings. "If all are satisfied," Miles said when the noise had subsided, "we shall proceed with the vote on Amory of Lusignan's proposal." He glanced nervously toward Reynald to see if he had any objections. The gruff old lord simply crossed his arms and leaned back in his seat, his silence serving as his reply. "Very well," Miles continued. "Seeking a majority, we shall begin with a hand vote. If there is any doubt, we will settle matters by ballot. All those in favour of Amory's proposal to address the problem of Saladin head-on, the details to be determined by the King's Council, raise your hands." A sea of hands shot up, leaving no doubt as to the court's will. Dietmar looked around, seeing even Reynald and Geldamar's hands raised in support of the motion. When he turned his gaze to the king, he saw Amalric's hand raised as well. The mood of the Frankish nobles was a fickle thing, so it may have been from a sense of shrewd self-preservation that they voted. Or maybe Gelmiro had been right. Jerusalem had to show her strength now or suffer for it later. "Those against?" Miles called out. Barely a dozen hands went up, mostly from those loyal to Ybert of Syria, or from those who harboured enough disdain for Amory to vote against their own interests. "The motion is passed," Miles declared, patting his sweating forehead with a cloth. He waved his free hand toward Amory, but the lord brushed past him, his lips curled back to show his teeth. "Ho there!" Amory called out, marching across the courtyard. "I didn't see your hand raised either way. Are you not fit to vote?" With a groan, Dietmar realized the words were meant for him. He hesitated, frozen in place, as he watched the lord bear down on him. "Shit." "Well," Amory barked, coming to stand before the front row. The other nobles had turned to stare, and he could hear Arn shuffling along the pillar beside him to create more space. Dietmar cleared his throat. "I did not think it right to vote on a fate I will not share in." Amory raised an eyebrow. "You won't be joining us in the defence of Jerusalem?" "I am returning home," Dietmar replied, opening his palms. "My lands need their master. I've been here 7 years. You must forgive me if I choose not to spend another." This seemed to satisfy Amory, who nodded, his expression softening somewhat. "What is your name, Chevalier?" "Where are you going?" The same question Paul had asked Christ when they met along the Appian Way. He thought of the Dead Sea spitting fire, a tumultuous shape shifting beneath its black waves, the rotten fruit in his mouth, and the mad Frenchman's hacking laughter. "Dietmar of Zwingenberg," he said, meeting Amory's yellow eyes. "A German!" Amory laughed, and something nasty appeared in his stare. "Your emperor entreats with the Kurdish dog, even while he snaps at our heels. Is that why you're leaving? You would rather get rich off Muslim coin than help your fellow Christians?" Dietmar tensed, feeling anger stir within him at Lusignan's words. He would not be made an example of, not like Ybert. "My emperor's business is his own," he replied firmly. "I have fought for God in his kingdom, and I have fought well. Longer than most." "Until the first real challenge presented itself," Amory mocked, waving his hand dismissively at Dietmar. "But isn't that the way with you Germans? Loyal only to your own?" Odo of St. Amad reappeared on the courtyard floor, prowling behind his lord like a caged lion. Amory's words went quiet, almost a whisper. "Or perhaps it is cowardice." The voice in the back of Dietmar's mind, the one that warned him when he'd drunk enough or when he'd spent too much time rolling dice, the voice he often ignored, urged him not to draw the knife on his belt and stab the bastard lord so full of holes his wine spilt from his belly across the yard. This time he listened, but only just. Amory noticed Dietmar's hand hovering over the blade and bared his teeth again, but before he could goad him on, King Amalric stirred from his seat, his pendulous gut hanging like a saddlebag from his torso. Go, sit your arse down, Amory," he said. "You'll have your war. Let the German go home to fuck his wife and raise his bastards. He's had enough of God's kingdom, and I've had enough of your voice." Amory held Dietmar's gaze a moment longer, then snorted and turned to the king. "My liege," he said, bowing so low it could only be mocking. With that he strode out of the courtyard, leaving his seat empty. The court soon followed.